After my husband died, his family changed the locks to our home while I was at the funeral director's office. When I returned, I found his sister Delphine and his mother Cordelia already sorting through our belongings, boxing up everything they deemed valuable. They looked at me with cold satisfaction, certain that everything now belonged to them. I just stood there in the doorway watching them work, and then slowly smiled. They had no idea what was coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Juliette, and until 6 weeks ago, I lived what I thought was a simple, happy life in the small town of Millbrook Springs with my husband Nathaniel. We'd been married for 12 years, and while we never had children, we had built something beautiful together. A cozy Victorian house on Elm Street that we'd restored room by room, a small but thriving antique restoration business, and a love that felt unshakable. Nathaniel was the kind of man who collected vintage pocket watches and knew the history of every building in town. He had gentle hands that could bring a broken antique back to life, and he always smelled like wood polish and the lavender soap I bought from the farmer's market. His family, however, was a different story entirely. The Ashworth family had old money, or at least they acted like they did. Cordelia, Nathaniel's mother, lived in the grand estate on Magnolia Hill that had been in the family for 3 generations. She wore pearls even to the grocery store and had opinions about everything, especially about me. From the day Nathaniel introduced me as his girlfriend, she made it clear that I wasn't good enough for her son. I was a librarian from the wrong side of town, someone who, quote, clearly didn't understand the importance of family legacy, as she so often reminded me. Delphine, Nathaniel's sister, was even worse. 2 years older than Nathaniel, she had married a wealthy businessman named Roderick and lived in a mansion in the neighboring town of Oakenford. She drove a silver Mercedes and wore designer clothes. But underneath all that polish was a woman who resented that her younger brother had inherited what she believed should have been hers. You see, Nathaniel's grandfather, old Theodore Ashworth, had been quite the character. He'd made his fortune in railroad investments and had very specific ideas about family and legacy. When he died 15 years ago, he left the family estate to Cordelia, but there were other assets. Mysterious assets that the family whispered about but never discussed openly in front of me. For years I heard fragments of conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. References to grandfather's collection, and the real inheritance, and what Nathaniel knows. But my husband was remarkably tight-lipped about his family's business. Whenever I asked, he'd just smile and say, "Don't worry about all that family drama, Jules. We have everything we need right here." I should have pressed him for details. I should have insisted on being included in family financial discussions. But I loved Nathaniel's gentle nature, and I trusted him completely. When you've been married for over a decade, you assume you know everything important about your spouse's life. The morning Nathaniel died, he'd been working in our garage workshop, restoring a 1920s mahogany writing desk for Mrs. Henderson down the street. It was a heart attack. Sudden, massive, completely unexpected for a healthy 42-year-old man. The paramedics said he died instantly. Probably didn't even know what was happening. I found him there among the wood shavings and half-finished projects, still wearing the old flannel shirt I'd bought him for Christmas. The pocket watch he always carried, a gift from his grandfather, had stopped at 11:47 a.m., as if time itself had paused in that moment when my world collapsed. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect from the Ashworth family. Elaborate, expensive, and somehow all about them, rather than about Nathaniel. Cordelia wore dramatic black and accepted condolences as if she were the widow. Delphine gave a speech about family legacy and carrying on traditions. I sat in the front row feeling like a stranger at my own husband's funeral. But the real shock came afterward. While I was at Pemberton Funeral Home signing paperwork and arranging for Nathaniel's ashes, Cordelia and Delphine had apparently decided they didn't need to wait for any legal processes. By the time I returned home 3 hours later, A locksmith was just finishing installing new deadbolts on both the front and back doors of my house. "Excuse me," I called out to the man packing up his tools. "What's going on here?" He looked uncomfortable, glancing at a work order in his hand. "Ma'am, I was hired to change the locks on this property. The lady who hired me said she's the new owner." Through the window, I could see Delphine directing two men as they loaded Nathaniel's antique tools into a moving truck. Cordelia was in our living room, wrapping our wedding china in newspaper with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for years. When I knocked on my own door, Delphine answered with a look of feigned surprise. "Oh, Juliette, I didn't expect you back so soon. She didn't invite me in. We're just securing the family assets until everything can be properly sorted out." "Family assets?" I felt like I was speaking a foreign language. "This is my home. These are my belongings." Cordelia appeared behind her daughter, holding one of Nathaniel's grandfather's pocket watches. "Actually, dear, this house was purchased with Ashworth family money. And these items," she gestured to the boxes around her, "are family heirlooms that need to be preserved properly." I stared at them, these two women who had barely spoken to me in 12 years of marriage, now acting like I was a trespasser in my own life. "You can't just change my locks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't legal." Delphine smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Oh, but it is legal, Juliette. You see, when our grandfather died, he left very specific instructions about the family inheritance. Instructions that Nathaniel should have explained to you, but apparently chose not to." She pulled out a folder of documents. "According to Theodore Ashworth's will, if Nathaniel died without direct heirs, which he did, all family assets revert to the surviving Ashworth bloodline. That's Mother and me." My heart started pounding. "But we were married. I'm his widow. That has to count for something." "Marriage," Cordelia said with disdain, "doesn't make you an Ashworth, and it certainly doesn't entitle you to what belongs to this family by blood." I stood there on the porch of the house where Nathaniel and I had shared 12 years of breakfasts and birthdays, watching strangers load our life into trucks while his family cited legal documents I'd never seen. That's when I did something that surprised all of us. I smiled. Because what Cordelia and Delphine didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Nathaniel had been keeping secrets from them too. And 3 days before he died, he'd finally told me everything. They thought they knew about old Theodore's inheritance. They thought they understood the family money and the legal documents and the precious heirlooms. But they had missed one crucial detail. Actually, they'd missed several crucial details. And I was about to turn their carefully planned takeover into the biggest mistake of their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand why that smile crossed my face as I watched Cordelia and Delphine systematically dismantling my life, you need to know the story of how Nathaniel and I met, and more importantly, what I discovered about the Ashworth family in the days before my husband's death. 12 years ago, I was working as the head librarian at the Millbrook Springs Public Library, a beautiful Carnegie library built in 1903 with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows. It was my sanctuary, filled with the smell of old books and the quiet satisfaction of helping people find exactly what they were looking for. I'd been there for 3 years after graduating from Westfield College with a degree in library science, and I thought I had my whole life mapped out. Then one Tuesday morning in October, a man walked in carrying a damaged antique book that looked like it had survived a house fire. He had kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, calloused hands that spoke of skilled work, and an apologetic smile as he approached my desk. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft and respectful, "but I was hoping you might know someone who could help restore this. It's a first edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass from 1855, and it belonged to my great-grandmother. There was a small kitchen fire at my mother's house last week, and this got damaged." I took the book gently, examining the singed pages and water damage. "This is remarkable," I whispered. recognizing immediately how valuable and rare it was. Your great-grandmother had excellent taste in literature. That's how I learned that Nathaniel Ashworth wasn't just any antique restorer. He was a craftsman who specialized in saving pieces of history that most people would have thrown away. We spent 2 hours that first day talking about book preservation techniques, and by the time he left, we'd made plans for me to visit his workshop the following weekend. His workshop was a converted carriage house behind the Victorian on Elm Street, filled with half-restored furniture, vintage tools organized with military precision, and the warm smell of wood stain and linseed oil. Nathaniel worked magic with his hands, bringing broken things back to life with a patience and skill that took my breath away. "Everything has a story," he told me that first afternoon, as he carefully cleaned the damaged pages of the Whitman book. "My job isn't to make things look new. It's to preserve their history while giving them more time to tell their stories." We were married 18 months later in a simple ceremony at the old stone church on Maple Avenue. Cordelia attended, dressed in black as if she were mourning rather than celebrating, and spent the entire reception telling anyone who would listen about the proper Ashworth weddings of generations past. Delphine gave us a crystal vase that I later discovered she'd bought at a discount store, still wearing the clearance sticker. But I didn't care about their disapproval. Nathaniel and I were building something beautiful together. We bought the Victorian house where his workshop was located, a 1890s Queen Anne with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that we painted soft yellow with white shutters. We spent weekends at estate sales and antique shops, Nathaniel teaching me to recognize quality craftsmanship, while I helped him research the historical provenance of the pieces he restored. Our business grew steadily. Nathaniel's reputation for meticulous restoration work spread throughout the region, and we developed a clientele of collectors, museums, and historical societies who trusted him with their most precious artifacts. I handled the business side, contracts, invoicing, client communications, while continuing my work at the library part-time. We tried for children for several years, enduring the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages and the invasive questions from Cordelia about continuing the family line. Eventually, we made peace with being childless and poured our nurturing instincts into our work, our home, and each other. For over a decade, I thought I understood our financial situation. Nathaniel's business brought in steady income, my library salary supplemented it, and we lived comfortably but modestly. We took annual vacations to historical sites: Colonial Williamsburg, Sturbridge Village, the Smithsonian. We drove a reliable but older Honda Civic and shopped at local farmers markets. What I didn't understand was why Nathaniel never seemed worried about money, even during lean months when restoration commissions were scarce. Why he could afford to turn down projects that didn't interest him. Why he never stressed about our mortgage payments or retirement savings the way other couples our age did. "Don't worry about all that, Jules," he'd say whenever I brought up financial planning. "The Ashworth family has always been good at taking care of their own." I assumed he meant Cordelia's money, the family estate, whatever inheritance might eventually come our way. But Nathaniel never asked his mother for financial help, and in fact, seemed to go out of his way to maintain our independence from the family wealth. The truth began to emerge 3 weeks before Nathaniel died, during what would be our last conversation about his family's history. We were sitting on our front porch on a warm evening in early September, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint our garden in golden light. Nathaniel had been unusually quiet all day, turning something over in his mind with the same focused concentration he brought to his most delicate restoration projects. "Jules," he said finally, setting down his wine glass and taking my hand, "there are some things about my family that I should have told you years ago. Things about my grandfather's inheritance that aren't what they seem." I felt a flutter of unease. In 12 years of marriage, Nathaniel had never been secretive or evasive with me about anything important. "What kind of things?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of cardinals build their nest in our oak tree. My grandfather Theodore was more than just a railroad investor. He was also a collector: art, rare books, historical artifacts, things that have become incredibly valuable over the years. Okay, I said slowly. But your mother has all that now, doesn't she? The estate? The collections? Nathaniel's smile was sad and knowing. That's what my mother and sister believe. And I've never corrected them because, honestly, I enjoyed watching them assume they knew everything about the family money. My heart started beating faster. What do you mean? Grandfather Theodore was a complicated man, Jules. He loved his family, but he also understood their weaknesses. He knew that Mother would flaunt wealth and that Delphine would see inheritance as a trophy to display. So he made arrangements, secret arrangements, to ensure that the most valuable parts of his legacy would go to family members who would truly appreciate and preserve them. I stared at my husband, this man I thought I knew completely, and realized there were depths to his family story that I'd never even suspected. Nathaniel, I said carefully, what exactly are you telling me? He squeezed my hand and looked directly into my eyes. I'm telling you that in 3 days, when the trust documents become effective on my 42nd birthday, I'm going to inherit approximately $12 million in assets that my mother and sister don't even know exist. The wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the porch boards, red wine spreading like blood across the white painted wood. But I barely noticed, because I was too busy processing the fact that my modest, unassuming husband had just told me we were about to become millionaires. 12 million, I whispered. The art collection alone is worth 8 million, Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and calm. Grandfather had impeccable taste and excellent timing. He bought pieces in the 1940s and 50s that are now considered masterworks. Plus, there are rare books, historical documents, and investment accounts that have been growing for decades. I tried to wrap my mind around this revelation. But why didn't you tell me? Why keep it secret for so long? Because I wanted to be sure, he said simply. Grandfather's will had very specific conditions about proving oneself worthy of the inheritance. I had to demonstrate that I could build a successful life based on my own skills and values, not family money. I had to show that I chose a partner for love, not financial gain. And I had to wait until my 42nd birthday for the trust to fully vest. My mind was reeling. So for 12 years you've been testing myself, he finished, proving to myself and to grandfather's legacy that I deserve this responsibility, and proving that when the time comes, I'll use this inheritance to preserve and protect things of real value, not just spend it on status symbols. I looked around our modest home, our carefully tended garden, our simple but contented life. And you're sure about this? The inheritance is really going to happen? Nathaniel pulled a key from his pocket, an old-fashioned brass key that looked like it belonged to a bank vault. This is the key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Millbrook Springs. Inside that box are the trust documents, the inventory of assets, and instructions for claiming everything grandfather left for me. He pressed the key into my palm, his fingers warm and steady around mine. Jules, if anything ever happens to me, I need you to know about this. Because according to the terms of the trust, if I die before claiming the inheritance, everything passes to my surviving spouse. I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Don't talk like that, Nathaniel. Nothing's going to happen to you. He smiled and kissed my forehead. I know, sweetheart. But grandfather was thorough in his planning, and I want to be thorough too. Promise me that if anything ever does happen, you'll go to that safety deposit box. Promise me you'll claim what's rightfully yours. I promised, of course. But I thought it was just my husband being overly cautious, planning for contingencies that would never come to pass. 3 days later, on September 15th, Nathaniel turned 42 and officially inherited $12 million in assets that his family didn't know existed. 3 weeks after that, he was dead. And now, as I stood on the porch of our yellow Victorian house watching Cordelia and Delphine load our belongings into moving trucks, I understood exactly why I was smiling. They thought they knew about Theodore Ashworth's inheritance. They thought they understood the family money and the legal documents. But they had no idea that the real treasure, the $12 million collection that Theodore had carefully hidden away, was sitting in a safety deposit box with my name on it as the rightful heir. The brass key was still in my purse, warm against my fingers as I touched it through the fabric. Let them take the furniture and the pocket watches and the family heirlooms they thought were so valuable. Because soon, very soon, they were going to discover just how wrong they were about everything. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room at the Willowbrook Inn, staring at the water-stained ceiling and trying to process the surreal reality of my situation. My husband was dead, his family had stolen my house, and I was apparently the secret inheritor of a $12 million fortune that nobody else knew existed. The brass key felt heavy in my hand as I sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed, still wearing yesterday's funeral dress. I hadn't slept more than an hour, my mind spinning between grief for Nathaniel and fury at his family's brazen theft of everything I thought belonged to me. But now, in the harsh light of morning, I realized I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. Cordelia and Delphine had clearly been planning this takeover for some time. They'd had legal documents ready, a locksmith on standby, and moving trucks scheduled within hours of Nathaniel's death. This wasn't a spontaneous power grab. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign. I needed to know what weapons they thought they had, and more importantly, what weapons I actually possessed. After a quick shower and a change into jeans and a sweater, I drove to First National Bank of Millbrook Springs. The building was a stately brick structure from the 1920s, with marble columns and the kind of solid, reassuring architecture that made you believe your money was safe inside. At the customer service desk, I presented Nathaniel's death certificate and the brass key, explaining that I needed access to my deceased husband's safety deposit box. The banker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Thornberry with kind eyes and silver hair, led me through the process with gentle efficiency. "I'm so sorry for your loss, dear," she said as we walked through the vault area. "Mr. Ashworth was such a lovely man. He always asked about my grandson's baseball games whenever he came in." The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected. Not just a small rectangular container, but a substantial metal drawer that required both Mrs. Thornberry's key and mine to open. When she slid it out and placed it on the private viewing table, then left me alone to examine its contents, I felt my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside was a leather portfolio that looked like something from a law office, thick with documents and photographs. But the first thing that caught my eye was an envelope marked "For Juliette," in Nathaniel's careful handwriting. I opened it with shaking fingers and found a letter dated just 1 week before his death. "My dearest Jules, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and I'm no longer with you. I'm sorry I didn't have more time to prepare you for what you're about to discover, but I wanted to wait until after my birthday to make sure everything was properly legally secured. By now, Mother and Delphine have probably tried to claim our house and possessions, citing grandfather's original will from 1978. Don't let them intimidate you. That document only covers the family estate and the items they know about. What they don't know is that grandfather created a second, secret trust in 1983, 5 years before he died. I've enclosed copies of all the relevant documents, but here's what you need to know. Grandfather Theodore wasn't just wealthy, he was extraordinarily wealthy, and he was much smarter than anyone in our family gave him credit for. He saw how money corrupted people, how it made Mother obsessed with status, and Delphine entitled and grasping, so he decided to test his heirs. The visible inheritance, the family estate, the obvious antiques, the social standing, went to Mother as expected. But the real treasure, the assets that represent true financial security and cultural significance, he hid away for a family member who would prove worthy of stewarding such responsibility. That inheritance is now yours, Jules, all of it. I love you forever, Nathaniel. Beneath his letter were dozens of official documents, trust agreements, bank statements, insurance policies, and what looked like inventory lists that went on for pages. But it was the photographs that made me gasp out loud. The first photo showed a painting I recognized immediately, a Van Gogh self-portrait that I'd only ever seen in art history books. The documentation showed that Theodore Ashworth had purchased it in 1952 for $35,000. According to the latest appraisal, dated just 6 months ago, it was now worth $4.2 million. The next photograph showed a rare manuscript, an original handwritten poem by Emily Dickinson, authenticated and appraised at $800,000. Then came images of a collection of Civil War-era documents signed by Abraham Lincoln, worth another $1.1 million. I flipped through page after page of photographs and appraisals. Ming Dynasty ceramics, first edition books by Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, Native American artifacts that had been ethically acquired and were now priceless, a collection of Tiffany lamps that belonged in a museum. But the truly staggering revelation came in the financial documents. Theodore hadn't just collected valuable objects, he'd been a brilliant investor. The trust contained stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and bonds that had been compounding interest for decades. The total liquid assets alone were worth over $8 million, separate from the art and collectibles. According to the bank statements, the trust had been generating enough income over the years to fund Nathaniel's comfortable lifestyle without him ever having to touch the principal. That's why he'd never worried about money, why he could afford to be selective about his restoration projects, why he'd been able to support our household so easily on what appeared to be modest earnings. But there was more. Theodore had been not just wealthy but politically connected. Among the documents were letters from senators, governors, and even a personal note from President Eisenhower thanking him for patriotic contributions to the nation's cultural preservation. Theodore Ashworth hadn't just been a railroad investor, he'd been a power broker, a man who influenced policy and shaped the cultural landscape of his era. And he'd left detailed instructions about how his secret inheritance should be managed. The collection was to be preserved and expanded, with portions donated to museums and historical societies over time. The financial assets were to be used for endeavors that enhance the cultural and educational enrichment of society. He'd essentially created a private foundation with me as the sole administrator. As I read through the documentation, I began to understand the full scope of what Cordelia and Delphine had missed. They thought they were fighting over a Victorian house, some antique furniture, and whatever modest savings Nathaniel had accumulated as a craftsman. In reality, they were squabbling over crumbs while completely missing the feast. The most shocking revelation came in a document titled Family Background Investigation Report, dated 1983. Theodore had apparently hired private investigators to research his own family members, documenting their spending habits, their values, and their character. The reports on Cordelia and Delphine were devastating. Cordelia was described as financially irresponsible, status-obsessed, with a tendency toward conspicuous consumption and social climbing. The investigator had documented her gambling habits, her tendency to live beyond her means, and her treatment of household staff and service workers. Delphine's report was even worse. Entitled, Manipulative, Views Inheritance as Personal Entitlement Rather Than Family Responsibility, shows no interest in preservation or stewardship, only in immediate gratification and social advancement. But the report on Nathaniel, compiled over several years of observation, painted a completely different picture. Demonstrates genuine appreciation for craftsmanship and historical preservation. Shows excellent judgment in romantic relationships, choosing partners based on character rather than financial considerations. Lives modestly despite access to family resources, suggesting proper values regarding money and responsibility. The investigators had even compiled a report on me, apparently from the period when Nathaniel and I were dating. Subject displays genuine intellectual curiosity, professional dedication to educational service, and authentic affection for Mr. Nathaniel Ashworth. No evidence of financial motivation in relationship. Demonstrates appropriate respect for historical and cultural artifacts. Apparently, Theodore Ashworth had been testing all of us for years, watching and evaluating who truly deserved his legacy. And according to the final document in the portfolio, a letter from Theodore himself, written shortly before his death, I had passed every test. To the heir of my secret trust. If you are reading this, you have demonstrated the qualities I hoped to find in my family's next generation. You have shown that you can build a meaningful life based on your own merits, that you can love and be loved for who you are rather than what you possess, and that you understand the difference between wealth and worth. This inheritance comes with great responsibility. These artifacts and resources are not merely personal assets. They are cultural treasures that must be preserved for future generations. Use this wealth wisely, share it generously, and remember that true legacy lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you contribute to the world. You are now the guardian of more than money and objects. You are the keeper of stories, the protector of history, and the steward of knowledge that belongs to all humanity. Signed, Theodore Ashworth, 1988. I sat back in the hard metal chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd just discovered. In the space of an hour, I'd gone from being a homeless widow to being one of the wealthiest women in the state. But more than that, I'd learned that my husband's family had been systematically evaluated and found wanting, while I, the outsider they'd never accepted, had been secretly approved as the rightful heir to a fortune they didn't even know existed. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Cordelia and Delphine, so convinced of their superiority and their birthright, had spent yesterday stealing furniture and pocket watches, while completely missing the fact that the real inheritance, worth more than they could comprehend, was sitting in a bank vault with my name on it. But as I carefully returned the documents to the portfolio, I realized that my situation was more complicated than simple vindication. Cordelia and Delphine weren't just greedy relatives who had underestimated me. They were people who had built their entire identities around being inheritors of Ashworth wealth and status. When they discovered what they'd missed, when they realized that I now controlled assets that dwarfed anything they'd ever imagined, they weren't going to simply apologize and walk away. They were going to fight. And given what I just learned about their characters from Theodore's investigations, they were gonna fight dirty. As I locked the safety deposit box and prepared to leave the bank, I understood that claiming my inheritance was only the beginning. The real challenge would be protecting it. And myself, from a family that had just discovered they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. Driving back from the bank, I felt like I was seeing Millbrook Springs with completely new eyes. The quaint downtown district, the tree-lined residential streets, even the modest hotel where I'd spent the night. Everything looked different when you realized you had enough money to buy half the town if you wanted to. But I wasn't thinking about buying anything, I was thinking about strategy. The documents in Theodore's portfolio had given me more than just financial security. They'd given me insight into exactly who I was dealing with. Cordelia and Delphine weren't just greedy. According to the private investigators' reports, they were systematically destructive people who had spent decades manipulating situations to their advantage. If I was going to protect Theodore's legacy and honor Nathaniel's memory, I needed to be smarter than they were. My first call was to Camden and Associates, the law firm that had been handling Theodore's secret trust for over 30 years. According to the documents, a lawyer named Harrison Camden had been the original architect of the hidden inheritance structure, and his son Jeffrey now managed the account. Mrs. Ashworth, Jeffrey Camden's voice was warm but professional when I reached him on his direct line. I've been expecting your call since I heard about Nathaniel's passing. Please accept my deepest condolences. Your husband was a remarkable man. Thank you, I said, pulling into the parking lot of a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind. I've just been to the safety deposit box, and I'm trying to understand exactly what I've inherited and what my responsibilities are. I imagine it's quite overwhelming, Jeffrey said kindly. Why don't you come to my office this afternoon? We have a lot to discuss, and I think it would be helpful for you to meet with our team. We've been preparing for this transition for some time. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a conference room at Camden and Associates, a prestigious firm located in a beautifully restored colonial building in the historic district of Millbrook Springs. Jeffrey Camden was a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair, and the kind of calm, authoritative presence that came from handling complex legal matters for wealthy families. With him were 2 other team members, Patricia Woolworth, a sharp-eyed estate specialist who had been working with the Ashworth Trust for 15 years, and Dr. Marcus Fairchild, a cultural historian and art authentication expert who served as the advisor for Theodore's collection. Mrs. Ashworth, Jeffrey began, spreading a series of documents across the polished mahogany table. What you've inherited is not just wealth, it's a carefully constructed legacy that has been decades in the making. Your husband's grandfather was an extraordinary man who understood that true wealth lies not just in accumulation, but in preservation and stewardship. Patricia opened a thick binder filled with photographs and appraisals. The collection currently includes 47 major artworks, including pieces by Van Gogh, Monet, Picasso, and several American masters. There are over 300 rare books and manuscripts, including original works by Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. The Native American Artifact Collection is one of the finest privately held collections in the country. Dr. Fairchild leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. But, perhaps most significantly, there are historical documents that scholars have been trying to locate for decades. Letters from Civil War generals, original drafts of speeches by Abraham Lincoln, even some previously unknown correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. These aren't just valuable, they're historically irreplaceable. I felt a flutter of excitement, despite the overwhelming nature of it all. As a librarian, I understood the significance of preserving historical documents, but I'd never imagined having direct responsibility for such treasures. Now, Jeffrey continued, the financial portfolio is structured to generate ongoing income while preserving the principal. Currently, the trust produces approximately $850,000 per year in dividends and interest, which has been accumulating since your husband's 21st birthday. That means there's also about $18 million in liquid assets available for immediate use. I nearly choked on my coffee. $18 million? In addition to the $12 million in art and collectibles? The trust has been very well managed, Patricia said with obvious satisfaction. Theodore Ashworth was not only wealthy, he was financially brilliant. He diversified across multiple asset classes and geographic regions. Even during market downturns, this portfolio has continued to grow. Dr. Fairchild pulled out another folder. But there's something else you need to understand, Mrs. Ashworth. Your husband's mother and sister aren't the only family members who might challenge your inheritance. Theodore had 2 other grandchildren. Cordelia's sister Margaret moved to California in the 1970s and has 2 adult children who might have claims to make. This was news to me. In 12 years of marriage, Nathaniel had never mentioned any West Coast relatives. Margaret Ashworth Chen and her children have been completely estranged from the family since a dispute over Theodore's funeral arrangements, Jeffrey explained. But legally, they could argue that they have rights to the estate. We don't believe their claims would be successful, given the specific language of Theodore's trust documents, but they could complicate matters significantly. Patricia nodded grimly. And there's another issue. Yesterday, while you were discovering the extent of your inheritance, Cordelia and Delphine filed legal documents with the county courthouse claiming that your marriage to Nathaniel was invalid due to, quote, failure to disclose material family assets. They're arguing that because Nathaniel didn't tell you about his expected inheritance, your marriage was based on fraud. I stared at her. That's ridiculous. We were married for 12 years. How could our marriage suddenly be invalid? It's a desperate legal maneuver, Jeffrey said, but it shows how quickly they're moving to challenge your rights. They've also filed a petition to freeze all of Nathaniel's known assets pending a full family court review. The good news, Dr. Fairchild added, is that they have no idea about the trust. All they know about is the house, the workshop, and whatever modest savings they think Nathaniel accumulated. The major assets are completely protected in legal structures they don't even know exist. Patricia spread out another set of documents. However, we need to be proactive. I recommend we immediately file countersuits establishing your rights as Nathaniel's legitimate widow and sole heir. We should also begin the process of transferring some of the trust assets into your direct control, which will make it much harder for anyone to challenge your ownership. Jeffrey leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. Mrs. Ashworth, I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you prepared for the kind of legal and personal battle that's about to unfold? Because once Cordelia and Delphine discover the true extent of what you've inherited, they're going to use every resource at their disposal to try to take it away from you. I thought about Nathaniel's letter, about Theodore's careful planning, about the years of investigation and evaluation that had led to this moment. I thought about the look of cruel satisfaction on Delphine's face as she locked me out of my own home, and the way Cordelia had handled our wedding china like she was entitled to every piece. "Mr. Camden," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yesterday I watched my husband's family steal my furniture while I grieved for the man I loved. They treated me like a stranger who had no right to mourn in my own home. They've spent 12 years making it clear that I would never be good enough for their family." I paused, thinking about the Van Gogh painting worth more than they could imagine, about the financial portfolio that could fund a small university, about the historical documents that belonged in the Smithsonian. Now I discover that I've inherited more wealth and cultural responsibility than they ever dreamed existed, and that Theodore Ashworth specifically chose me over his own blood relatives to be the guardian of his legacy. I smiled, and it felt fierce and determined. "Oh yes, Mr. Camden, I'm absolutely prepared for this battle." Dr. Fairchild grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been waiting 30 years to see someone worthy finally claim Theodore's collection. Your husband often talked about your intelligence and your integrity. He said you were the kind of person who understood that some things are more important than money." Patricia was already pulling out forms and legal documents. "Then let's get started. We need to establish your legal standing immediately, and we need to do it in a way that protects both you and the collection from any future challenges." Jeffrey opened his laptop. "I'm going to call our private investigator. If Cordelia and Delphine want to play dirty, we need to know exactly what kind of dirt they might try to throw. And frankly, after reading Theodore's files on them, I suspect there's quite a lot to discover." As the team began outlining our strategy, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Nathaniel's death: hope. Not just hope for justice or vindication, but hope that I could honor the trust that both Theodore and Nathaniel had placed in me. They thought they knew who they were dealing with. They thought I was just a grieving widow with no resources and no support. But they were about to discover that they'd picked a fight with someone who had $30 million. A team of the best lawyers in the state, and nothing left to lose. More importantly, they were about to learn that I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the preservation of cultural treasures, for the honor of my husband's memory, and for the vindication of a man who had spent decades watching his family prove themselves unworthy of the legacy they thought they deserved. The real battle was just beginning. 3 days after my meeting with Jeffrey Camden's legal team, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about the Ashworth family dynamics. The call came at 6:30 in the morning while I was having coffee in my hotel room, still processing the overwhelming reality of my new situation. "Mrs. Ashworth, this is Detective Ray Holbrook with the Millbrook Springs Police Department. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention regarding your husband's death." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" "Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Could you come to the station this morning? And, Mrs. Ashworth, you might want to bring your attorney." An hour later, I sat in a sterile interview room at the police station with Jeffrey Camden beside me, facing Detective Holbrook, a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent gray eyes and the careful manner of someone who had seen too much human deception. Mrs. Ashworth, Detective Holbrook began, opening a thick file folder. Yesterday we received a formal complaint from Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth and Mrs. Delphine Ashworth Morrison, alleging that your husband's death may not have been from natural causes. The room seemed to tilt sideways. What are you talking about? Nathaniel had a heart attack. The paramedics confirmed it. The medical examiner. Yes, ma'am, I understand that's what everyone believed, Detective Holbrook interrupted gently. But Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth has provided us with some information that raises questions about the circumstances. He slid a document across the table. According to this complaint, your husband had no history of heart disease, was in excellent physical condition, and had just passed a comprehensive physical examination 2 months ago with flying colors. They're suggesting that the sudden nature of his death, combined with your newfound claims to significant inheritance, creates a suspicious pattern. Jeffrey's voice was ice cold. Detective, are you seriously telling us that these women are accusing my client of murdering her own husband? I'm telling you that we're required to investigate any credible allegations of foul play, especially when they involve potential financial motives. Detective Holbrook pulled out another document. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth also claims that you've been making false statements about inheriting money that doesn't exist, and that you may have fabricated documents to support fraudulent inheritance claims. I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole. This is insane. They're the ones who broke into my house and stole my belongings. They're the ones making fraudulent claims. Actually, Mrs. Ashworth, Detective Holbrook said carefully, they've provided documentation showing that the house at 47 Elm Street is legally owned by the Ashworth Family Trust, not by you personally. They claim they had every right to secure family property after Mr. Nathaniel Ashworth's death. Jeffrey was already pulling documents from his briefcase. Detective, my client has extensive documentation proving her legitimate inheritance claims. What Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth and Mrs. Delphine Morrison don't know is that there are legal trusts and estates they've never been informed about. Detective Holbrook examined Jeffrey's papers with interest. This is certainly more complex than the initial complaint suggested, but that brings us to another concern. He pulled out a photograph that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of me at the bank 3 days ago, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. In the image, I was clearly visible entering First National Bank, carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Morrison hired a private investigator to follow you, Detective Holbrook explained. She suspected you might be involved in some kind of financial fraud. When the investigator reported that you'd accessed a safety deposit box just days after your husband's death and left carrying a briefcase full of documents, it raised additional red flags. Those are legitimate estate documents, Jeffrey said firmly. My client has every right to access her husband's safety deposit box. I'm sure that's true, Detective Holbrook nodded. But here's where things get complicated. We contacted Dr. Samuel Brennan, the medical examiner who signed off on Mr. Ashworth's death certificate. Dr. Brennan is now retired, but when we spoke with him yesterday, he admitted that he performed what he called a, quote, routine examination without ordering toxicology tests or a full autopsy. My heart started pounding. What does that mean? It means that if there had been any unusual substances in your husband's system, they wouldn't have been detected. Dr. Brennan said that given Mr. Ashworth's apparent good health and the obvious signs of cardiac arrest, he saw no reason for extensive testing. Jeffrey leaned forward. Detective, you're talking about exhuming my client's husband based on the accusations of family members who are clearly engaged in a bitter inheritance dispute. Actually, Mr. Camden, we're talking about more than that. Detective Holbrook pulled out yet another document. This morning we received additional information from a source we can't disclose, but it concerns allegations that Mrs. Juliette Ashworth has been involved in suspicious financial activities for some time. What kind of activities? I managed to ask. Anonymous tips suggesting that you've been systematically accessing and liquidating assets that don't belong to you. Claims that you've been forging documents and manipulating elderly clients at the library where you work. I stared at him in shock. That's completely false. I've worked at the Millbrook Springs Library for 15 years. My record is spotless. We're sure it is, Detective Holbrook said. But we have to investigate these claims. And frankly, Mrs. Ashworth, when we see a situation involving a sudden death, immediate inheritance claims worth millions of dollars, and family members alleging fraud, well, it raises questions. Jeffrey's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. Detective, I need to step outside for a moment. There's been a development in this case that you need to be aware of. When Jeffrey returned 5 minutes later, his face was grim. Detective Holbrook, I've just spoken with my associate who's been researching the Ashworth family background. We've discovered something significant about the source of these allegations. He placed a file on the table. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth has been in serious financial trouble for the past 3 years. She's mortgaged the family estate twice, defaulted on significant loans, and is currently facing foreclosure proceedings. Mrs. Delphine Morrison is also heavily in debt. Her husband's business failed 18 months ago, and they're facing bankruptcy. Detective Holbrook raised his eyebrows. And how does this relate to the current allegations? It means they have desperate financial motives for trying to invalidate my client's inheritance claims, Jeffrey explained. But more importantly, it means they've been systematically lying about their financial status and their knowledge of family assets. He pulled out another document. This is a bank record showing that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth attempted to access a safety deposit box at First National Bank just 2 days before her son's death. A safety deposit box that she claimed belonged to her father, Theodore Ashworth. My mouth fell open. She knew about the trust? According to the bank manager, Mrs. Ashworth claimed she had legal authority to access all family accounts after her son's marriage. She was denied access because she wasn't listed as an authorized user, but the attempt was documented. Detective Holbrook was studying the papers with intense concentration. So you're suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth knew about additional family assets and was trying to access them before her son's death? I'm suggesting more than that, Jeffrey said quietly. I'm suggesting that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth and Mrs. Delphine Morrison have been planning to contest any inheritance claims for some time. The timing of these allegations, coming immediately after they discovered my client had accessed the safety deposit box, suggests this is a coordinated attack designed to discredit her while they try to locate and claim assets they believe should belong to them. I felt sick as the implications sank in. You're saying they knew about the trust before Nathaniel died? We're saying it's possible, Jeffrey replied carefully. And if that's true, then their allegations about your husband's death and your inheritance claims take on a very different character. Detective Holbrook closed his file folder. Mr. Camden, Mrs. Ashworth, this investigation is going to continue. But given what you've shown me today, I think we need to look more carefully at who's making these allegations and why. He turned to me. Mrs. Ashworth, I need to ask you directly. Did you have any reason to harm your husband? No, I said firmly. I loved Nathaniel more than anything in the world. The idea that I would hurt him is obscene. And did you know about this trust and the assets before his death? Nathaniel told me about it 3 weeks before he died, but I never imagined it was worth this much money, and I certainly never thought about it in terms of inheritance. I thought we'd manage it together for decades. Detective Holbrook nodded slowly. Mrs. Ashworth, here's what's going to happen. We're going to investigate these allegations thoroughly, but we're also going to investigate the people making them. If we find evidence that this is a fraudulent attempt to manipulate the legal system for financial gain, there will be serious consequences. As we left the police station, Jeffrey walked me to my car. Juliette, this changes everything. They're not just trying to steal your inheritance. They're trying to destroy your reputation and possibly have you arrested for murder." I gripped my car keys tightly. How is this possible? How can they make these accusations when they're the ones who've been lying and stealing? "Because they're desperate," Jeffrey said grimly. "And desperate people do desperate things. But they've just made a crucial mistake." "What mistake?" "They've shown us that they knew more about Theodore's assets than they've been admitting. And if they knew about the trust before Nathaniel's death, then we need to ask a very serious question. What exactly were they planning to do about it?" As I drove back to the hotel, one terrible thought kept echoing in my mind. If Cordelia and Delphine had known about the trust, if they had understood that Nathaniel's death would trigger the inheritance to pass to me, then the question wasn't whether I had a motive to harm my husband. The question was whether they did. That evening, I sat in my hotel room staring at my laptop screen, trying to process the devastating possibility that my husband's family might have been involved in his death. The police investigation had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, but I knew I had to understand the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. I called Dr. Marcus Fairchild, the cultural historian who had been working with Theodore's collection. If anyone understood the deep history of the Ashworth family dynamics, it would be him. "Mrs. Ashworth." His voice was warm but concerned when he answered. "Jeffrey told me about the police investigation. I've been expecting your call." "Dr. Fairchild, I need to understand something. You've been working with this family for years, managing Theodore's collection. Have you ever suspected that Cordelia or Delphine knew more about the trust than they let on?" There was a long pause. "Mrs. Ashworth, why don't you come to my office tomorrow morning? There are some things about the Ashworth family history that I think you need to see. Things that might explain what's happening now." The next morning, I found myself in Dr. Fairchild's office, located in a converted Victorian mansion that housed the Millbrook Springs Historical Society. The walls were lined with antique maps, historical photographs, and glass cases containing artifacts from the town's past. Dr. Fairchild, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, greeted me with a pot of coffee and a grim expression. "Juliette," he said, settling into his chair across from me, "what I'm about to show you has been sealed in our archives for 35 years. Theodore Ashworth left specific instructions that these documents should only be revealed if there was ever a legal challenge to his inheritance structure." He opened a large archival box and pulled out a thick folder marked Ashworth Family Investigation, Confidential. Theodore wasn't just concerned about his family's character, Dr. Fairchild explained. He was actually frightened of them. Specifically, he was frightened of what they might do if they ever discovered the true extent of his wealth. He spread out a series of documents across his desk. "These are private investigator reports, but not the ones you saw at Jeffrey's office. These are much more detailed and much more disturbing." The first document was titled Cordelia Ashworth, Psychological Profile 1985. As I read through it, my hands began to shake. Subject displays consistent patterns of manipulation, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation. Has systematically isolated family members who challenge her authority. Shows particular hostility toward daughters-in-law and other women who might compete for family influence. Financial records indicate pattern of theft from household accounts and charity organizations where she volunteers. Of particular concern, subject has made repeated comments to family members suggesting that she deserves to inherit family wealth and that anyone preventing this inheritance wouldn't be around long. While these statements could be interpreted as emotional hyperbole, the consistent pattern raises questions about subject's psychological stability. The report on Delphine was even more alarming. Subject demonstrates sociopathic tendencies including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and inability to accept responsibility for consequences. Has history of financial fraud, including insurance claim manipulation and embezzlement from previous employers. Marriage appears to be motivated primarily by financial considerations. Subject has made specific inquiries about methods of accessing family trusts, inheritance acceleration, and legal methods of challenging wills. Has also researched untraceable poisons and drug interactions. Recommend extreme caution. I looked up at Dr. Fairchild in horror. Theodore thought they might actually harm someone for money? Theodore was a very intelligent man who had watched his family carefully for decades, Dr. Fairchild replied quietly. These aren't casual observations. These are the conclusions of professional investigators and psychologists who studied Cordelia and Delphine extensively. He pulled out another document. But here's what really concerns me. This is a report from 1987, just 1 year before Theodore's death. The document was titled Family Threat Assessment, Urgent Update. Cordelia Ashworth has become increasingly desperate about her financial situation. Recent gambling debts and poor investment decisions have left her facing potential bankruptcy. She has been observed making contact with questionable individuals, possibly related to debt collection or loan sharking. Of immediate concern, Cordelia has been asking detailed questions about Theodore's health, his medications, and his daily routines. She has also inquired about the family's life insurance policies and the procedures for claiming death benefits. Delphine Morrison has been equally concerning. She has researched methods of challenging wills, accelerating inheritance claims, and has made veiled threats about taking care of problems within the family. Recommendation: Theodore should take immediate steps to protect himself physically and legally. Consider relocating valuable assets and implementing security measures. Dr. Fairchild opened another folder. Theodore took these warnings seriously. He not only created the secret trust, but he also documented every suspicious interaction he had with his family members. The next documents were handwritten notes in Theodore's careful script, dated throughout 1987 and early 1988. March 15, 1987, Cordelia visited today, ostensibly for Sunday dinner. Spent considerable time examining my medication bottles and asking about my daily routine. When I mentioned feeling tired lately, she seemed unusually interested in my symptoms. April 2, 1987, Delphine called asking detailed questions about my will and whether I'd made any recent changes. When I deflected, she became angry and said, "People who keep secrets from family usually regret it." June 18, 1987, found Cordelia in my study going through my personal papers. She claimed to be organizing but was clearly searching for financial documents. When confronted, she became hostile and accused me of hiding things from the family. August 30, 1987, both Cordelia and Delphine visited together, which is unusual. They spent the entire evening discussing my health and suggesting I should make arrangements for my care. The conversation felt more like a threat than concern. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Theodore's death. February 14, 1988. I believe my family is planning something. Cordelia has been unusually attentive, insisting on preparing my meals and bringing me tea every evening. I've started feeling dizzy and nauseous after these visits. My doctor can find nothing wrong, but I suspect I'm being slowly poisoned. I've arranged for blood tests to be conducted after my death, but I fear it may be too late. If something happens to me, the authorities should investigate Cordelia and Delphine. I stared at the page, feeling sick. Dr. Fairchild, are you telling me that Theodore suspected his own family was trying to kill him? I'm telling you that Theodore Ashworth died of what appeared to be a heart attack, but he had specifically requested that toxicology tests be performed. Dr. Fairchild's voice was heavy with regret. Those tests were never conducted. The family insisted on immediate cremation, claiming it was Theodore's wish, though no such documentation existed. He pulled out a final document. This is a letter Theodore left with me, to be opened only if there were suspicious circumstances surrounding future deaths in the family. To whoever reads this, if another member of my family has died under questionable circumstances, particularly my grandson Nathaniel, you must understand that Cordelia and Delphine are capable of murder. They have demonstrated willingness to harm family members for financial gain. They are intelligent, patient, and utterly ruthless. I pray that Nathaniel will be wise enough to protect himself and any spouse he may have. But if something happens to him, know that my family has a history of eliminating obstacles to their inheritance claims. The irony is that neither Cordelia nor Delphine understands that their greed and violence have disqualified them from inheriting anything of value. The real wealth I've accumulated will go to someone worthy, someone who proves themselves through character rather than bloodline. Do not let them escape justice. They have already killed once. Theodore Ashworth, February 1988. I couldn't speak for several minutes. The implications were staggering. Not only had Theodore suspected his own murder, but he'd predicted that Cordelia and Delphine might kill Nathaniel as well. Dr. Fairchild, I finally managed, why didn't you give this information to the police when Theodore died? I tried, he said sadly. But Cordelia had convinced everyone that Theodore was becoming paranoid and mentally unstable in his final months. She produced witnesses who claimed he'd been acting erratically, forgetting things, making wild accusations. The family doctor supported her story, saying Theodore had been showing signs of early dementia. And now? Now I understand that it was all part of their plan. They discredited Theodore's mental state so that if he accused them of poisoning him, no one would believe him. Dr. Fairchild leaned forward intently. Juliette, if Theodore was right about his own murder, and if the same people had financial motives to kill Nathaniel, then they've been planning this for 35 years, I finished quietly. More than that, they've been practicing. They've refined their methods, learned how to manipulate medical examiners and police investigations, figured out how to appear as grieving family members rather than suspects. I thought about Nathaniel's sudden heart attack, about his perfect health just weeks before, about how quickly Cordelia and Delphine had moved to secure what they thought were family assets. Dr. Fairchild, if I take this information to the police, will they believe it? Or will Cordelia and Delphine claim that I forged these documents to support my inheritance claims? They're all originals, stored in our archives with proper documentation, he assured me. But Juliette, if we're right about this, if they really did kill Theodore and Nathaniel, then you're not just fighting for an inheritance anymore. What am I fighting for? His expression was grave. You're fighting for your life. Because if they realize you have access to Theodore's real fortune, and if they understand that you could expose them for murder, they're not going to simply give up and walk away. They're going to try to kill me too. Dr. Fairchild nodded solemnly, and they've had 35 years to perfect their technique. The morning after my devastating meeting with Dr. Fairchild, I woke up to find that everything had accelerated beyond my worst fears. My phone was buzzing with an urgent call from Jeffrey Camden at 5:47 a.m. Juliette, you need to get out of that hotel immediately. His voice was tight with anxiety. Don't pack anything, don't check out normally, just leave through a back exit if possible and get to my office right now. What's happening? I asked, already pulling on clothes with one hand while holding the phone with the other. Cordelia and Delphine have filed for an emergency court order to have you detained as a flight risk. They're claiming you've liquidated massive amounts of assets overnight and are preparing to leave the country with stolen inheritance money. My blood ran cold. That's impossible. I haven't touched any money except what I need for the hotel. I know that, but they've presented bank records to the court showing large transfers from accounts allegedly under your control. The records are forgeries, but sophisticated ones. They've also claimed they have evidence that you've been planning to flee to a country without extradition treaties. I was moving toward the door now, my heart pounding. Jeffrey, how could they create fake bank records that quickly? Because they've been planning this for a long time, Juliette, much longer than we realized. They didn't just stumble into this inheritance fight. They've been preparing for it for months, possibly years. As I crept down the hotel's back stairwell, Jeffrey continued with more devastating news. There's more. This morning, they're also requesting an emergency exhumation order for Nathaniel's body. They're claiming they have new evidence suggesting poisoning, and they're arguing that the delay in ordering toxicology tests was due to your influence over the medical examiner. My influence? I barely spoke to Dr. Brennan for 5 minutes at the funeral home. They're claiming you had a romantic relationship with him that predates your marriage to Nathaniel, and that you used this relationship to ensure no autopsy was performed. I reached my car in the hotel parking lot, scanning the area for any sign of surveillance. That's insane. I've never even met Dr. Brennan before Nathaniel died. Insane but effective. They've produced what appear to be love letters and photographs, supposedly showing you with Dr. Brennan over the past several years. Again, forgeries, but convincing ones. As I drove toward Jeffrey's office through the quiet, early morning streets of Millbrook Springs, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. Jeffrey, how are they creating all these fake documents so quickly? Professional help. Very expensive, very skilled professional help. Which means they've either found funding somewhere, or they've been preparing for this battle much longer than we thought. I pulled into the parking lot behind Camden and Associates, just as Jeffrey emerged from the building. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled and his face drawn with stress. "Juliette, we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out our next move," he said, ushering me quickly into his office. "Patricia and Dr. Fairchild are already here. We've been working all night." Inside, Patricia Woolworth looked up from a computer screen covered with legal documents, her expression grim. Dr. Fairchild sat at the conference table surrounded by boxes of historical records, his silver hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "Juliette," Patricia said without preamble, "we've discovered something disturbing. Cordelia and Delphine aren't working alone. They've hired Blackstone Investigations, one of the most expensive and unscrupulous private investigation firms in the state." Dr. Fairchild looked up from his documents. Blackstone specializes in what they call inheritance acceleration, helping clients manipulate legal systems to speed up inheritance claims. They're known for creating false evidence, bribing officials, and intimidating rival claimants. "How can they afford that kind of help if they're facing bankruptcy?" I asked. Jeffrey sat down heavily in his chair. "That's what we've been trying to figure out, and we think we have an answer, but you're not going to like it." He pulled out a file folder. "We've been investigating their financial situation more thoroughly. Yes, they're both in serious debt, but they've recently received significant funding from an unexpected source." "What source?" "The California relatives. Margaret Ashworth Chen and her children have been funding Cordelia and Delphine's legal battle." I stared at him. The estranged relatives that Nathaniel never mentioned? Why would they help? Dr. Fairchild answered, "Because Margaret never accepted being cut out of Theodore's obvious inheritance. She's been watching the family from afar for 35 years, waiting for an opportunity to claim what she believes should have been hers." Patricia pulled up documents on her laptop. Margaret's son David is a successful tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. He's worth about $40 million. And he's been financing this entire operation because his mother convinced him that the family cheated her out of a massive inheritance. "But that doesn't make sense," I protested. "Margaret was cut out of Theodore's will for good reasons, and she doesn't know about the secret trust any more than Cordelia and Delphine do." "Actually," Jeffrey said quietly, "we think she does know, or at least she suspects something exists." He spread out a series of documents. "Look at this timeline. Margaret moved to California in 1978, the same year Theodore created his original will. But she didn't just disappear. She's been monitoring the family ever since. She has hired private investigators to watch Theodore, then Cordelia, then Nathaniel." Dr. Fairchild pulled out a folder from his boxes. "I found this in Theodore's papers last night. It's a letter he received in 1985 from Margaret, threatening to expose family secrets unless she was included in his inheritance planning. The letter was typed on expensive stationery, but the tone was venomous. "Dear Father, you think you can write me out of the family fortune because I dared to marry someone you disapproved of. But I know there's more to your wealth than the house and the obvious antiques. I know you've been hiding assets, and I know you're planning to leave everything to Nathaniel. If you don't reconsider my position in your will, I'll make sure the IRS takes a very close look at your financial dealings over the past 20 years. I'll also make sure Cordelia and Delphine understand exactly how much you've been hiding from them. You have 6 months to make this right, or I'll destroy your precious legacy and make sure nobody gets anything. Your daughter, Margaret. Theodore never responded to this letter, Dr. Fairchild explained, but he kept it, along with documentation of private investigators he hired to monitor Margaret's activities in California. Patricia leaned forward. Here's what we think is happening. Margaret has been funding Cordelia and Delphine's legal battle, but not out of sisterly loyalty. She's using them as pawns to destabilize your inheritance claim so that she can swoop in later with her own legal challenge. Once they've discredited you and created chaos around Nathaniel's death, Jeffrey continued, Margaret will emerge as the, quote, responsible family member who can bring order to the situation. She'll claim that as Theodore's surviving daughter, she has superior rights to any disputed inheritance. But she doesn't know about the $30 million in assets, I said. No, but she suspects something valuable exists, and she's willing to spend $1 million of her son's money to find out what it is. Jeffrey's expression was grim. And here's the truly dangerous part. Margaret has been researching the family history more thoroughly than anyone. If she's discovered Theodore's suspicions about his own murder, then she knows that Cordelia and Delphine are killers, I finished. Dr. Fairchild nodded solemnly. And she's chosen to work with them anyway. Which means Margaret is just as dangerous as they are. Possibly more so because she has the resources to make their plans work. Patricia pulled up another document on her computer. Juliette, we've also discovered that the emergency court hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. If the judge grants their motion, you could be arrested as early as tonight. What's their timeline? I asked, feeling the walls closing in around me. Jeffrey consulted his notes. Based on the legal filings, they're moving for immediate detention today, emergency exhumation tomorrow, and they want preliminary autopsy results within 72 hours. If they can establish any suspicious circumstances around Nathaniel's death, they'll push for formal murder charges by the end of the week. And once you're arrested for murder, Patricia added, any inheritance claims you've made become much easier to invalidate. Even if you're eventually cleared of criminal charges, the civil case becomes much more complicated. Dr. Fairchild was staring at the historical documents spread across the table. There's something else. Something I found in Theodore's papers that's been bothering me all night. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a note Theodore wrote in 1987, just after Margaret's threatening letter. It says, if Margaret is willing to work with Cordelia and Delphine despite knowing their nature, then she is even more dangerous than they are. A person who knowingly collaborates with killers is someone who will kill without hesitation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Juliette, Jeffrey said quietly, we're not just dealing with Cordelia and Delphine anymore. We're dealing with a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple family members, professional criminals, and potentially millions of dollars in funding. And they're not just trying to steal your inheritance, Patricia added. They're trying to frame you for murder while planning to commit another one. I looked around the room at these 3 people who had become my allies in a fight that seemed increasingly impossible to win. So what do we do? Jeffrey stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the peaceful streets of Millbrook Springs. We have exactly 6 hours before that court hearing. 6 hours to find evidence that will expose this conspiracy and protect you from being arrested. And if we can't find that evidence? I asked. He turned back to me, his expression serious but determined. Then we implement the contingency plan Theodore created for exactly this situation. The one that will reveal the truth about this family once and for all, no matter what it costs. I felt a chill run down my spine. What contingency plan? Dr. Fairchild was already reaching for another box of documents. The one that will force them to reveal their true motives in open court, even if it means putting you in mortal danger to do it. Dr. Fairchild opened the final box of Theodore's documents with reverent care, as if he were handling ancient artifacts. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a leather-bound journal with emergency protocols, embossed in gold lettering on the cover. Theodore didn't just suspect his family might kill him, Dr. Fairchild explained as he carefully opened the journal. He planned for it. And he planned for what would happen to whoever inherited his legacy after him. The first page contained Theodore's handwriting in precise, measured strokes. If this journal is being read, it means the Ashworth family conspiracy has escalated beyond theft and manipulation to attempted murder. The person reading this is likely my chosen heir, and they are in immediate mortal danger from multiple family members working in coordination. The following protocols are designed to expose the truth, protect the innocent, and ensure that justice is served even if I am no longer alive to see it. Jeffrey leaned over my shoulder as I read. Juliette, Theodore essentially created a legal trap that would spring only if his family tried to harm his chosen heir. He anticipated exactly what's happening to you right now. Dr. Fairchild turned the page to reveal a detailed strategy outline. Look at this. Theodore identified 3 phases of family escalation: financial manipulation, legal intimidation, and finally, attempted murder. We're now in phase 3. The journal contained specific instructions for each phase, but the section labeled Phase 3 Response made my hands tremble as I read it. If the family has moved to attempted murder charges or direct physical threats, implement the following protocol immediately. 1. Activate the witness protection system I have established. 2. Release the sealed evidence packages to law enforcement and media simultaneously. 3. Trigger the automatic financial transparency protocols. 4. Initiate the family history exposure sequence. Patricia looked up from her laptop. Theodore was brilliant. He created a dead man's switch. If anyone tried to harm his heir, it would automatically expose everything about the family's criminal history. What's a dead man's switch? I asked. Jeffrey explained while pulling documents from the journal. It's a system that activates automatically if certain conditions are met. Theodore set up multiple triggers that would release devastating information about Cordelia, Delphine, and Margaret if they tried to harm you. Dr. Fairchild was examining a sealed envelope marked Emergency Activation Only. According to these instructions, we need to contact a specific law firm in Boston, provide them with a code phrase, and they'll begin releasing information that Theodore has been gathering about the family for decades. What kind of information? I asked. Jeffrey was reading through the protocols. Financial records showing decades of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Medical records that were hidden during Theodore's death investigation. Recorded conversations between family members discussing murder. And most importantly, evidence of their involvement with organized crime figures. My jaw dropped. Organized crime? Dr. Fairchild nodded grimly. Remember, Cordelia had gambling debts and was dealing with loan sharks. Theodore documented her connections to some very dangerous people. People who specialize in making murders look like natural deaths. Patricia had been typing furiously on her laptop. I've just accessed the Boston law firm's emergency contact system. Apparently, Theodore set up automatic payments to ensure this firm would maintain his evidence collection indefinitely, just waiting for the activation signal. She turned her screen toward us. Look at this. The firm has been automatically collecting updated information about the family for 35 years. Bank records, travel information, communication monitoring, even DNA samples that Theodore collected from family gatherings. Jeffrey was studying the activation protocols, but here's the genius part, and the dangerous part. To activate this system, Juliette has to voluntarily put herself in direct physical danger from the family members. What do you mean? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I knew the answer. Theodore's plan requires you to confront Cordelia, Delphine, and Margaret directly, wearing recording equipment, and get them to confess to their crimes. The system won't activate unless there's clear evidence that they're actively threatening your life. Dr. Fairchild looked up from the journal. He designed it this way because he knew that without direct confessions, the family could claim all the evidence was fabricated or circumstantial. But if they threaten you while being recorded, if they admit to previous murders while trying to commit another one, then they can't claim innocence, I finished. But Dr. Fairchild, this plan requires me to basically offer myself as bait to 3 people who have already killed twice. Patricia was reading more details from her laptop connection to the Boston firm. Actually, it's more complicated than that. According to the emergency protocols, all 3 family factions have to be present: Cordelia and Delphine, Margaret and her son David, and you. Theodore's plan only works if he can expose the entire conspiracy at once. Jeffrey stood up and began pacing. The brilliance is that they'll all think they're in control of the situation. Each faction believes they're manipulating the others. But if we can get them all in the same room, their competing interests will force them to reveal their true motives. And how exactly do we get them all together? I asked. They're not exactly going to accept a dinner invitation from me. Dr. Fairchild smiled for the first time all morning. Actually, Theodore anticipated that too. He pulled out another document from the journal. We're going to tell them that you've discovered the location of Theodore's secret vault. Secret vault? A vault that doesn't exist, Jeffrey said, understanding the strategy immediately. But they don't know that. We're going to make them believe that Theodore hid the most valuable parts of his collection in a physical location that requires multiple keys to access. Patricia was already typing. I can send a message through the court system that looks like a desperate legal filing. Something that makes it appear you found evidence of additional assets, but you need family cooperation to access them. Dr. Fairchild consulted the journal. According to Theodore's plan, we tell them the vault contains the original paintings, the most valuable manuscripts, and documentation about Swiss bank accounts worth $50 million. $50 million? I gasped. A complete fabrication, Jeffrey assured me, but it's an amount so large that none of them can afford to ignore it. Cordelia and Delphine will want to steal it, Margaret will want to claim it as rightful inheritance, and David will see it as justification for his mother's 40-year quest. Patricia looked up from her screen. Here's the beautiful part. We can use their own legal maneuvering against them. Since they've filed for an emergency court hearing this afternoon, we can request that all family members be present for the asset disclosure. We make it seem like you're being forced to reveal the vault location under court order. Dr. Fairchild was reading through more of Theodore's instructions. The plan calls for the meeting to take place at the family estate on Magnolia Hill, neutral ground where Cordelia will feel confident and in control. We tell them the vault is hidden somewhere on the property. But what's to stop them from just killing me immediately, I asked. Jeffrey consulted the journal. Theodore thought of that too. The plan requires you to convince them that the vault has a sophisticated security system that requires biometric identification from you specifically. If you die or are injured, the vault permanently locks and the contents are automatically donated to the Smithsonian. And they'll believe that? Dr. Fairchild nodded. Theodore was known for elaborate security measures and eccentric legal arrangements. Plus, modern technology makes biometric locks completely plausible. They'll have to keep you alive at least long enough to access the vault. Patricia was setting up recording equipment from a case she'd pulled from Jeffrey's office closet. These are military-grade audio and video recording devices. Virtually undetectable, completely admissible in court. And they broadcast live to multiple law enforcement agencies simultaneously. Jeffrey handed me an earpiece smaller than a button. We'll have teams positioned around the estate. The moment they threaten you directly or confess to previous murders, we can move in. But Juliette, you have to understand, once we activate this plan, there's no going back. you'll be in a room with 3 murderers who think you're the only thing standing between them and $50 million. I stared at the recording equipment, thinking about Nathaniel's gentle hands and kind eyes, about Theodore's decades of careful planning, about the cultural treasures that would be lost forever if Cordelia and Delphine succeeded in their scheme. "Dr. Fairchild," I asked, "if we don't do this, if I refuse to take this risk, what happens to Theodore's collection? What happens to justice for Nathaniel and Theodore?" His expression was sad but honest. The collection becomes tied up in legal battles for decades. Cordelia and Delphine eventually succeed in claiming portions of it, which they'll sell to fund their lifestyle. The historical documents get scattered or destroyed, and they get away with 2 murders while probably planning a 3rd. Patricia had finished setting up the equipment. "Juliette, there's something else you should know. I've been monitoring the court filings, and Margaret's son David arrived in Millbrook Springs 2 hours ago. He's not just funding this operation, he's here to oversee it personally. Which means all the key players are now in town," Jeffrey noted. "If we're going to do this, it has to be today." I picked up the tiny recording device, feeling its weight, so small, but carrying the power to expose decades of family crime and corruption. "How long do I have to decide?" Jeffrey checked his watch. "The court hearing is in 4 hours. If we're going to implement Theodore's plan, we need to start making the calls now. Once we set this in motion, you'll be meeting with 3 murderers in approximately 6 hours." I thought about everything I'd learned over the past week, about Theodore's wisdom, Nathaniel's love, and the incredible responsibility I'd inherited. I thought about the Van Gogh painting worth millions, the historical documents that belonged to humanity, and the justice that 2 good men deserved. "Make the calls," I said firmly. "Set up the meeting. It's time to finish what Theodore started." Dr. Fairchild began dialing the Boston law firm. Patricia started drafting the legal documents. Jeffrey opened his laptop to coordinate with law enforcement. And I sat quietly for a moment, saying a silent prayer to Nathaniel and preparing to walk into a trap that would either expose the truth or cost me my life. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I sat in the passenger seat of Jeffrey's car as we drove up the winding road to the Ashworth family estate on Magnolia Hill. The recording devices were so small and sophisticated that I could barely feel them. One in my earring, another disguised as a button on my blouse, and a backup device hidden in the heel of my shoe. Each one was broadcasting live to a command center that Jeffrey's team had established in a van parked half a mile away. The estate loomed before us like something from a Gothic novel, a massive Victorian mansion with turrets, wraparound porches, and gardens that had been meticulously maintained for over a century. Theodore had built this house in 1892 as a symbol of Ashworth prosperity, never knowing that it would become the stage for exposing his family's decades of murder and corruption. "Remember," Jeffrey said quietly as we pulled up the circular driveway, "your goal is to get them talking about their plans, their past actions, and their knowledge of Theodore's death. The Boston law firm won't release the evidence until we have clear audio of them threatening your life or confessing to previous crimes." Through my earpiece, I could hear Detective Holbrook's voice from the command center. "Mrs. Ashworth, we have teams positioned around the perimeter of the estate. The moment we hear a direct threat against your life, we're moving in. But until then, you're on your own." Patricia's voice came through as well. The court filing worked perfectly. "All 3 family factions believe you've been forced to reveal the vault location under legal pressure. They think they're walking into an opportunity, not a trap." As we approached the front door, I saw 3 cars already parked in the driveway: Cordelia's silver Mercedes, Delphine's white BMW, and a black Tesla with California plates that had to belong to Margaret and David. My heart pounded as I realized that within minutes, I would be face to face with the people who had murdered my husband. Jeffrey squeezed my hand. "You can still back out, Juliette. We can find another way." I shook my head. "No, Nathaniel deserves justice, and Theodore's legacy deserves protection. Let's do this." The front door opened before we could ring the bell. Cordelia stood there dressed in an elegant black suit, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression a carefully controlled mask of grief and determination. She looked every inch the grieving matriarch, protecting her family's interests. "Juliette," she said with false warmth, "I'm so glad you've finally come to your senses about cooperating with the family. Please, come in." The foyer was exactly as I remembered from the few family gatherings I had attended over the years: marble floors, crystal chandelier, oil paintings of stern-faced Ashworth ancestors looking down from gilded frames. But now, knowing what I knew about the family's true nature, the grandeur felt sinister rather than impressive. Delphine emerged from the parlor, also dressed in black, her expression less controlled than her mother's. There was something predatory in her eyes, a barely contained excitement that made my skin crawl. "Hello, Juliette," she said, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. "I understand you have some important information to share with us about Father Theodore's arrangements." "Where are the others?" I asked, needing all the conspirators present for Theodore's plan to work. "In the library," Cordelia replied, leading us through the mansion's ornate hallways. "Margaret and her son arrived this morning. It's been quite emotional, reuniting with family after so many years of estrangement." The library was a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, and tall windows overlooking the estate's gardens. But my attention was immediately drawn to the two people standing near the fireplace. Margaret Ashworth Chen was a thin, elegant woman in her 70s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of Delphine. Her son David was a younger version of the same calculating intelligence. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of predatory confidence that comes from making millions by exploiting others' weaknesses. "So this is the famous Juliette," Margaret said, her voice carrying a slight trace of a California accent mixed with old East Coast money. "The librarian who somehow convinced my father to leave her a fortune that should have belonged to his daughters." David stepped forward, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm David Chen. I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who's caused so much disruption in our family." As I shook his hand, I noticed his grip was stronger than necessary, and he held on just a moment too long, a subtle intimidation tactic that told me he was every bit as dangerous as Theodore had suspected. Jeffrey moved closer to me. "Perhaps we should get straight to business. My client is here under court order to disclose the location of additional family assets, but she has concerns about the legal implications." Cordelia settled into a leather armchair with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling family meetings. "Juliette, we're all reasonable people here. We simply want to ensure that Theodore's legacy is preserved and that family assets remain within the family where they belong." "Family assets," I repeated, letting a note of bitterness creep into my voice. "Is that what you call them? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like this family has been systematically looting Theodore's estate for decades." Delphine's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of anger. "Careful, Juliette. You're hardly in a position to make accusations." Margaret moved closer, her voice deceptively gentle. "My dear, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about how inheritance works in families like ours. Blood relationships create obligations and rights that marriage simply cannot supersede." "Even when that blood relationship involves murder?" I asked quietly. The room went completely silent. I could feel Jeffrey tense beside me, and through my earpiece I heard Detective Holbrook's voice. "Good, Juliette. Keep pushing." David was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Ashworth. I hope you have evidence to support such claims." "Actually, I do," I said, pulling a folder from my purse, one of the decoy documents Jeffrey had prepared. "Theodore was more thorough in his record-keeping than any of you realized." Cordelia leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the folder. "What kind of records?" "Medical records, for one thing. documentation of his symptoms in the weeks before his death, bank records showing unusual financial activity, and audio recordings. Delphine shot to her feet. Audio recordings of what? Family conversations, I said, watching their faces carefully. Theodore was paranoid in his final months. He recorded everything. Phone calls, dinner conversations, private meetings. He was particularly interested in documenting discussions about his health and his will. Margaret and David exchanged a look that confirmed they knew exactly what such recordings might contain. "Where are these supposed recordings?" Margaret demanded. "In the vault," I replied, "along with everything else Theodore wanted to keep safe from his family." David moved closer, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps we should discuss this more, privately. Family matters are best handled within the family." Jeffrey stepped between us. "My client is here under court order. Any discussions need to be on the record." "Actually," Cordelia said with a cold smile, "I think Mr. Camden should wait in the foyer. This is a family meeting, and he's not family." "I'm not leaving my client alone with you," Jeffrey replied firmly. Delphine pulled out her phone. "Then perhaps we should call the court and explain that Mrs. Ashworth is refusing to comply with the disclosure order. I'm sure the judge would be very interested to hear about her lack of cooperation." Through my earpiece, I heard Detective Holbrook. "Juliette, we need more direct evidence. Get them talking about their plans." I made a decision that terrified me. "Jeffrey, it's okay. Wait in the foyer. I need to have an honest conversation with my family." Jeffrey looked at me with concern, but nodded. "I'll be right outside if you need me." As soon as Jeffrey left, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The pretense of civility evaporated, and I found myself facing four people whose true nature was now fully visible. Margaret sat down across from me, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Now then, Juliette, let's discuss the reality of your situation. You have information we need, and we have resources you can't possibly match." David pulled up a chair, positioning himself to block my path to the door. "My mother has been very patient, waiting 35 years for justice regarding her inheritance. But patience has its limits." Cordelia's smile was predatory. "You see, dear, the problem isn't just that you've inherited money that should belong to the family. The problem is that you know things that could be problematic for all of us." Delphine moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the garden, but actually positioning herself to watch for any approaching vehicles. "The question is whether you're smart enough to take the generous offer we're about to make, or whether you're going to force us to handle this situation in a more traditional manner." I felt the recording devices capturing every word, transmitting the evidence that would finally expose this family's true nature. But I also realized that I was now trapped in a room with four people who had collectively committed multiple murders and were clearly preparing to commit another. "What kind of offer?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the fear that was making my hands shake. Margaret leaned back in her chair, completely relaxed now that the pretense was over. "Oh, it's quite simple, really. You're going to take us to Theodore's vault, help us access whatever he's hidden there, and then you're going to have a very unfortunate accident." David nodded, his businessman's demeanor completely gone. "Nothing dramatic, you understand? Just a tragic fall down some stairs, or perhaps a heart attack brought on by the stress of recent events." Very sad, very believable. Through my earpiece, I heard multiple voices. "We have enough. Teams are moving in now." But Cordelia was already standing up, and there was something in her hand that made my blood freeze. "Actually," she said, her voice now completely devoid of warmth, "I think we should handle this exactly the way we handled Theodore and Nathaniel. After all, why change a proven method?" The small vial in Cordelia's hand caught the light from the library's crystal chandelier, casting prismatic reflections across the leather-bound books that lined the walls. It was barely larger than a perfume sample, filled with a clear liquid that looked innocuous enough to be water. "This is digitalis," Cordelia said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. "Extracted from foxglove plants that grow right here in Theodore's garden. The same substance that gave my father his fatal heart attack 35 years ago. Margaret leaned forward with interest. How poetic. Using Theodore's own garden against his chosen heir. David pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. I've just sent a text to the court clerk explaining that you've become emotionally unstable during our family meeting. Apparently, the stress of the inheritance dispute has triggered a complete psychological breakdown. Delphine moved away from the window and picked up an antique letter opener from Theodore's desk. The beauty of digitalis is that it mimics a natural heart attack perfectly. Even if they perform an autopsy, which they won't, given your history of recent trauma, it would take very specific testing to detect it. Through my earpiece, I could hear urgent voices from the command center, but they seemed distant and unreal compared to the immediate threat facing me. Teams are 60 seconds out, Detective Holbrook's voice crackled. Keep them talking. You killed Theodore with that? I asked, trying to keep them talking while looking for any possible escape route. The library had only one door, and David was positioned directly in front of it. Cordelia smiled with what appeared to be genuine fondness. Oh yes, it took weeks of planning, of course. I couldn't simply poison his dinner. Theodore was far too suspicious for that, but he had such a sweet tooth, especially for the honey cakes I used to bring him. You poisoned his food repeatedly, I said, the horror of it washing over me. Small doses, Margaret interjected with clinical interest, enough to weaken his heart gradually, so that when the final dose was administered, it would appear to be the natural culmination of declining health. David was typing on his phone again. I'm documenting your increasingly erratic behavior for the court record. According to our account, you've just confessed to murdering your husband and are now threatening to harm yourself rather than face justice. Delphine tested the weight of the letter opener in her hand. Of course, we can't have you simply drinking the digitalis willingly. That would raise too many questions. We'll need to make it look like you fought back. Hence the letter opener, Cordelia explained cheerfully. A few defensive wounds, signs of a struggle, and then the digitalis administered during the altercation. Very tragic, but completely understandable given your mental state. I backed toward the tall windows overlooking the garden, trying to put some distance between myself and the letter opener. What about Nathaniel? How did you kill him? Margaret stood up and moved to block my path to the windows. That was more challenging, actually. Nathaniel was young and healthy, and he'd become quite suspicious after Theodore's death. We couldn't use the same gradual poisoning method. So you recruited help, I said, remembering Theodore's notes about Cordelia's connections to loan sharks and criminals. David nodded approvingly. Very good, Mrs. Ashworth. Yes, Mother had developed some useful business relationships through her gambling activities. People who specialize in making problems disappear. Cordelia opened the vial and poured the clear liquid into a crystal glass that had been sitting on Theodore's desk. A professional came to town 3 weeks before Nathaniel died. He spent time learning your husband's routines, his habits, his daily schedule. The digitalis was administered through his morning coffee, Delphine continued, clearly enjoying the explanation. A massive dose, delivered right before he went out to his workshop. The heart attack occurred exactly when and where we planned it. Through my earpiece, I heard, 30 seconds. Teams are surrounding the house now. Margaret pulled out a small digital recorder. We've been documenting this entire conversation, of course. But the official record will show that you confessed to both murders before taking your own life in a fit of guilty remorse. You see, David said, still typing on his phone, you've been quite unstable since Nathaniel's death. The stress of the inheritance investigation, the financial pressures, the guilt over what you'd done, it all became too much to bear. Cordelia picked up the glass containing the digitalis, holding it like a toast. To family loyalty, dear Juliette, and to the importance of blood being thicker than water. I could hear sounds from other parts of the house now, muffled voices, footsteps, what might have been doors opening. But the 4 conspirators were so focused on their elaborate murder plan that they didn't seem to notice. "There's just one problem with your plan," I said, trying to buy more time as the sounds grew closer. Delphine raised the letter opener. "And what's that?" "Theodore was smarter than all of you combined." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean there is no vault. There never was a vault. Theodore's real treasure was never hidden in some secret location. It was hidden in plain sight, protected by legal structures you were too stupid and too greedy to discover." David's confidence faltered slightly. "That's impossible. We know there are millions in assets unaccounted for." $30 million, I said, watching their faces change as the number hit them, plus art worth another $20 million. All of it legally transferred to me through trust structures that have been in place for decades. Cordelia's hand tightened on the glass. "You're lying. The Van Gogh self-portrait alone is worth more than everything you've stolen combined. The Dickinson manuscripts, the Lincoln documents, the Native American collection, it's all mine, legally and completely." Margaret's voice rose to an angry shriek. "That's impossible. My father would never leave that much money to an outsider." "He didn't leave it to an outsider," I replied. "He left it to the person he considered worthy of preserving his legacy. Someone who understood that wealth means responsibility, not just consumption." Delphine lunged forward with the letter opener, but at that exact moment, the library doors burst open and Detective Holbrook entered with 4 armed officers, weapons drawn. "Police! Nobody move!" The scene that followed was chaos. Delphine dropped the letter opener, the blade clattering across the marble floor. David tried to delete something from his phone before raising his hands. Margaret began shouting about illegal searches and demanding lawyers. But Cordelia, her face twisted with rage and 35 years of thwarted greed, raised the glass containing the digitalis as if she planned to force me to drink it. "If I can't have Theodore's money," she screamed, "then nobody can." She lunged toward me with the poisoned glass, but Detective Holbrook was faster. His taser caught her in the chest, and she collapsed to the floor, the glass shattering and sending digitalis splashing across Theodore's antique Persian rug. As the officers moved in to secure the scene, I heard Jeffrey's voice from the doorway. "Are you all right, Juliette?" I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, but I managed to nod. "I'm alive, and we got everything on record." Detective Holbrook was already reading rights to the 4 conspirators. Margaret Ashworth Chen, Delphine Morrison, David Chen, Cordelia Ashworth. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and accessory to murder in the deaths of Theodore Ashworth and Nathaniel Ashworth. As they were being handcuffed and led away, Margaret turned back to me one last time. "This isn't over, you little nobody. You'll never be worthy of Ashworth money, no matter what some old man's will says." David was more controlled, but equally venomous. "You have no idea what you've inherited, Mrs. Ashworth. That money comes with enemies you can't imagine. This family has connections you'll never escape." Delphine was sobbing hysterically as the officers led her toward the door. "It's not fair. We're his real family. We deserved that money." But it was Cordelia's final words that chilled me to the bone. As she was being led past me in handcuffs, she leaned close and whispered, "Theodore thought he was so clever with his secret trust. But there are other family members he never knew about. Other people with legitimate claims. You haven't won anything. You've just painted a target on your back." As the library emptied of criminals and police officers, I stood alone among the scattered evidence of the family's murderous conspiracy. The broken glass, the dropped letter opener, the digital recorder that had captured their confessions. Jeffrey put his arm around my shoulders. "It's over, Juliette. They're going to prison for the rest of their lives." But Cordelia's final warning echoed in my mind. Were there really other family members out there? Other threats I hadn't anticipated? Dr. Fairchild appeared in the doorway carrying a box of Theodore's documents. "Actually," he said quietly, "there's something else we need to discuss." something I found in Theodore's papers about distant relatives who might still pose a threat. I looked around the library where Theodore had once sat reading, where Nathaniel had played as a child, where a family's legacy of murder and greed had finally been exposed. The immediate danger was over, but I realized that claiming my inheritance was only the beginning. The real challenge would be protecting it, and myself, from whatever other dark secrets the Ashworth family history might still contain. 6 months later, I sat in the same courthouse where this nightmare had begun, but this time I was in the gallery watching justice finally being served. The trial of Cordelia Ashworth, Delphine Morrison, Margaret Ashworth Chen, and David Chen had captivated the entire region, with media outlets describing it as the inheritance murder conspiracy that shocked New England. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming. The recordings from that day in the library provided crystal-clear evidence of their confessions to murdering both Theodore and Nathaniel. But it was the additional evidence that Dr. Fairchild and the Boston law firm had accumulated over the decades that truly sealed their fate. Patricia Woolworth sat beside me, reviewing the final sentencing documents. Theodore's evidence collection was even more extensive than we initially realized, she whispered as the judge prepared to announce the sentences. 35 years of documented financial fraud, tax evasion, insurance scams, and connections to organized crime figures. The investigation had revealed the staggering scope of the family's criminal enterprise. Cordelia's gambling debts had led her into business relationships with loan sharks who specialized in inheritance acceleration, helping desperate heirs eliminate obstacles to their financial windfalls. Theodore's murder in 1988 had been their first successful collaboration, but not their last. Detective Holbrook had traced at least 6 other suspicious deaths across 3 states, all involving elderly individuals with substantial inheritances and family members who had consulted with Cordelia's criminal contacts. The digitalis method had been refined over decades, with each murder appearing more natural than the last. Margaret's role had been equally sinister. Her technology company connections in California had provided the sophisticated document forgery capabilities, while her son David's business network had laundered money and provided false identities. The Chen family had essentially built a high-tech criminal enterprise around inheritance theft and murder. Judge Catherine Brennan, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, called the court to order. The defendants will rise for sentencing. Cordelia stood first, her once elegant appearance now haggard after months in jail. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup. She looked every bit her 73 years, diminished by the weight of her crimes. Cordelia Ashworth, Judge Brennan began, her voice carrying the gravity of final judgment. You have been found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Theodore Ashworth and Nathaniel Ashworth, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. The court sentences you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole on the murder charges, plus an additional 40 years on the remaining counts. Cordelia's legs buckled, and she had to be supported by her court-appointed attorney. The reality of spending her remaining years in prison had finally broken through her decades of entitlement and arrogance. Delphine was next, her face streaked with tears as she faced her own judgment. Delphine Morrison, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and accessory after the fact. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years on the conspiracy charges. Margaret maintained her composure better than her nieces, standing straight and defiant even as Judge Brennan read her sentence. Margaret Ashworth Chen, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, and directing a criminal enterprise. The court sentences you to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Finally, David Chen stepped forward, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his posture. David Chen, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison. As the sentences were announced, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that justice had finally been served for Theodore and Nathaniel. Satisfaction that their killers would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. But also a profound sadness that it had taken so long for the truth to emerge. Jeffrey Camden sat in the row behind me, and he leaned forward to whisper, "The financial restitution orders are being processed now. The court has ordered them to forfeit all assets obtained through their criminal activities, which amounts to approximately $8 million that will be donated to historical preservation societies." Dr. Fairchild, now officially serving as the curator of Theodore's collection, had tears in his eyes as he watched the proceedings. "Theodore would be so proud," he said quietly, "not just of the justice, but of how you've honored his legacy." Over the past 6 months, I had worked with Dr. Fairchild and a team of museum curators to properly catalog and preserve Theodore's incredible collection. The Van Gogh self-portrait was now on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Dickinson manuscripts were being studied by literary scholars at Harvard. The Lincoln documents had been donated to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, where they were providing new insights into Civil War history. But perhaps most importantly, I had established the Theodore and Nathaniel Ashworth Foundation for Historical Preservation, using the income from the trust to fund programs that protected cultural artifacts and supported historical research. It was exactly what Theodore had envisioned when he chose me as his heir. As the court session ended and the defendants were led away in shackles, Detective Holbrook approached me in the hallway. "Mrs. Ashworth, I wanted to let you know that we've closed the investigations into those 6 other suspicious deaths. The evidence from this case has provided the missing links we needed to prove they were murders. How many families will finally have answers about their loved ones?" I asked. 6 families across Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Elderly relatives who supposedly died of natural causes, but whose deaths cleared the way for significant inheritances. In each case, family members had consulted with Cordelia's criminal contacts in the months before the deaths. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had started as Theodore's suspicions about his own family had uncovered a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades. Patricia joined us, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. "Juliette, there's one more piece of business we need to discuss. The court has officially recognized your sole ownership of all Theodore's assets, and the final insurance settlements have been processed." She handed me a document that made my eyes widen. "This is the final accounting of the trust assets, including insurance payouts for Theodore's and Nathaniel's wrongful deaths, plus the financial penalties assessed against their killers." The total was staggering: $47 million in liquid assets, plus the art collection now valued at $32 million, plus the real estate holdings worth another $8 million. Theodore's careful investments and legal planning had created a legacy worth nearly $90 million. Theodore included provisions for this scenario in his original trust documents, Dr. Fairchild explained. He anticipated that if his family members were ever prosecuted for murder, the insurance companies would be obligated to pay wrongful death benefits. He even negotiated clauses that would triple the payouts if the deaths were proven to be premeditated murder. I stared at the numbers, overwhelmed by the responsibility. "Dr. Fairchild, this is more money than some small countries have. How am I supposed to manage this responsibly?" "The same way Theodore did," he replied with a warm smile. "By remembering that wealth is a tool for preserving culture and advancing knowledge, not for personal consumption. You've already proven yourself worthy by establishing the foundation and donating major pieces to museums." As we walked out of the courthouse together, Jeffrey fell into step beside me. "Juliette, there's something else you should know. The FBI investigation into the criminal network has led to arrests in California, Nevada, and Florida. This case has dismantled an entire inheritance fraud operation that was responsible for dozens of deaths over 3 decades. I paused on the courthouse steps, looking back at the building where justice had finally been served. Do you think Theodore and Nathaniel can rest in peace now? Dr. Fairchild placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I think they're both very proud of what you've accomplished. You didn't just expose their killers. You honored their memory by using their legacy to benefit humanity. Patricia checked her watch. Speaking of which, we need to get to the museum. The new exhibition of Theodore's collection opens this afternoon, and the governor is supposed to cut the ribbon. As we walked toward our cars, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been a grieving widow locked out of her own home by greedy relatives. Now I was the steward of one of the most significant private cultural collections in America, responsible for preserving treasures that would educate and inspire future generations. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was also a privilege that few people ever experienced. Theodore had chosen well when he decided to trust his legacy to someone who understood that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in preservation and sharing. But even as I celebrated this victory, I couldn't forget Cordelia's final warning about other family members who might pose future threats. The immediate danger was over, but I suspected that managing Theodore's legacy would require constant vigilance against those who valued money more than the cultural treasures it could protect. For now, though, justice had been served. Theodore and Nathaniel could rest in peace, and their legacy would live on through the foundation and the countless scholars, students, and history lovers who would benefit from their preserved collection. The inheritance war was over. The real work of honoring their memory was just beginning. 1 year later, I stood in the grand ballroom of the newly restored Ashworth Cultural Center, watching hundreds of guests admire the permanent exhibition of Theodore's collection. The mansion on Magnolia Hill, once the setting for a family's dark conspiracy, had been transformed into a beacon of education and cultural preservation that welcomed visitors from around the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same rooms where Cordelia, Delphine, Margaret, and David had plotted murder now housed some of America's most precious historical artifacts. The library where they had confessed to killing Theodore and Nathaniel was now a research center where scholars studied original documents from the Civil War era. "Mrs. Ashworth," called a voice behind me, and I turned to see Dr. Sarah Martinez, the director of the Smithsonian's American History Museum. "The Lincoln exhibition is absolutely remarkable. The letters you've donated are already changing how historians understand his relationship with Congress during the war's final months." I smiled, remembering Theodore's words about how artifacts belonged to all humanity, not just to their owners. Theodore would be thrilled to know his collection is advancing historical understanding. That's exactly what he hoped would happen. Dr. Martinez gestured toward a group of excited college students gathered around a display case containing Emily Dickinson's handwritten poems. And the educational impact has been extraordinary. We're seeing record numbers of young people engaging with 19th century literature because they can see the actual manuscripts. As I moved through the exhibition, I reflected on the incredible transformation my life had undergone in just 18 months. The frightened widow who had been locked out of her own home had become one of the most influential cultural philanthropists in New England. But more importantly, I had found a purpose that gave meaning to the tragedy of losing Nathaniel. Jeffrey Camden approached with a champagne flute and a satisfied expression. "Juliette, I just got off the phone with the Attorney General's office. The final appeals from the Ashworth murder conspiracy have been denied. Cordelia and Delphine will never see the outside of a prison again." The legal aftermath had been extensive but decisive. All 4 conspirators had attempted appeals, claiming everything from insufficient evidence to prosecutorial misconduct. But the overwhelming documentation of their crimes, combined with the audio and video recordings from that final confrontation, had made their convictions unshakable. What about the federal investigation into their criminal network? I asked. Complete success, Jeffrey replied with satisfaction. 43 arrests across 7 states, with prosecutions still ongoing. The inheritance murder conspiracy they uncovered has been called one of the most extensive criminal enterprises in American history. Dr. Fairchild joined our conversation, carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized as one of Theodore's original document collections. Juliette, I have some news that I think will interest you. We've finally completed the authentication process on the Revolutionary War documents. He opened the portfolio to reveal letters written in faded brown ink on aged parchment. These are original correspondence between George Washington and Benjamin Franklin during the Constitutional Convention. Theodore acquired them in the 1960s, but we've only now been able to verify their authenticity using modern forensic techniques. My breath caught as I saw the signatures at the bottom of the letters. How much are they worth? Individually, each letter is worth between $2 and $5 million, Dr. Fairchild said quietly, but as a collection, they're essentially priceless. These documents provide insights into the founding of our nation that historians have never had access to before. I thought about Theodore's wisdom in keeping these treasures safe for decades, waiting for the right moment and the right person to ensure their preservation. They need to go to the National Archives, don't they? Actually, Dr. Fairchild said with a smile, I was hoping you'd say that. The Archivist of the United States has personally requested the opportunity to house them permanently. They want to create a special exhibition called the Ashworth Collection, Hidden Voices of the Founding Era. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations with museum directors, university presidents, and foundation executives from across the country. The Theodore and Nathaniel Ashworth Foundation had become a major force in cultural preservation, funding everything from archaeological expeditions to digital archives that made historical documents accessible to students worldwide. But it was a conversation with a young girl named Emma, visiting the museum with her 4th grade class from Millbrook Springs Elementary, that touched me most deeply. Mrs. Ashworth, she said, tugging on my dress as I passed by a display of Native American artifacts, my teacher says you used to work at our library. I did, I replied, kneeling down to her level. I was the head librarian there for 15 years. Did you always know you were going to be rich and famous? She asked with the directness that only children possess. I laughed, thinking about how utterly unprepared I had been for any of this. No, Emma. A year and a half ago, I was just a librarian who loved books and history. I never imagined I would be responsible for taking care of treasures like these. How did you learn how to do it? She asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. I learned the same way you're learning, I told her. By asking questions, by reading, by listening to people who know more than I do, and by remembering that the most important thing is not to own beautiful things, but to make sure other people can enjoy and learn from them too. Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. Maybe I could work in a museum someday and take care of old things too. I think that's a wonderful dream, I said, and I meant it. This was exactly what Theodore had envisioned, inspiring future generations to value and preserve human culture and knowledge. As the reception wound down and the last guests departed, I found myself alone in the mansion's restored library, the same room where the family's murderous conspiracy had finally been exposed. The antique furniture had been carefully preserved, but the atmosphere was completely transformed. Where once there had been menace and greed, now there was peace and purpose. I walked to the tall windows overlooking the gardens, where the foxglove plants that had provided Cordelia's murder weapon had been removed and replaced with a memorial garden dedicated to Theodore and Nathaniel. White roses and lavender created a peaceful space where visitors could reflect on the importance of preserving history and honoring memory. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Woolworth. The final audit is complete. The foundation now controls assets worth $127 million, generating annual income of $8.2 million for cultural preservation programs. Theodore's legacy has never been stronger. I smiled, thinking about how Theodore's careful planning had created something far greater than he could have imagined. Not only had his wealth survived his family's attempts to steal and squander it, but it had grown into a force that was actively preserving culture and educating future generations. A soft knock on the library door interrupted my thoughts. Jeffrey entered, carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "I thought you might want to toast the anniversary," he said, setting the glasses on Theodore's restored desk. "It was exactly 18 months ago that you first came to my office, terrified and homeless, asking for help with an inheritance you didn't understand. I accepted the champagne, thinking about that frightened woman who had discovered her husband's secret flash drive. Jeffrey, do you think I've done right by Theodore's trust? Do you think I've proven worthy of this responsibility?" He raised his glass with a warm smile. "Juliette, in 18 months you've exposed a multi-state murder conspiracy, brought justice to dozens of families, preserved priceless cultural artifacts, established one of the most respected foundations in the country, and inspired thousands of students to care about history and culture. I think Theodore chose exactly the right person." We clinked glasses as I looked around the peaceful library, so different from the scene of terror it had been just a year ago. You know what the strangest part is? I don't miss my old life at all. I loved being a librarian, and I'll always treasure those years with Nathaniel. But this feels like what I was meant to do. "Maybe that's what Theodore saw in you," Jeffrey suggested. "Not just someone who could preserve his collection, but someone who could grow it into something even greater." As we finished our champagne and prepared to leave the mansion, I thought about Emma's questions and dreams. Somewhere out there were future historians, archaeologists, museum curators, and cultural preservationists who would be inspired by the collections and programs that Theodore's legacy was making possible. The inheritance war that had begun with changed locks and stolen furniture had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. Theodore and Nathaniel's memory lived on, not just in the artifacts they had preserved, but in the countless lives that would be touched by education, discovery, and the preservation of human culture. I locked the mansion's front door and walked toward my car, the same Honda Civic I had driven throughout this incredible journey. Despite having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, I had chosen to keep the simple reminders of who I had been before inheritance changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the foundation's work, and new ways to honor the trust that Theodore had placed in me. But tonight, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook Springs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Complete peace. The girl who had once been locked out of her own home had found something far more valuable than financial security. I had found purpose, legacy, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using privilege responsibly. Theodore and Nathaniel could rest in peace. Their legacy was in good hands, and it would continue growing and inspiring for generations to come. That was the greatest inheritance of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.